Hi everybody, this is Charley Eiseman and I'm going to talk to you about Vernal Pool Certification. Vernal pools are temporary ponds that fill with water in the spring and dry up later in the year, or maybe they hold water all year in some years, but they at least dry out every few years, and that's important because that means no fish can live in those pools, and therefore certain sensitive amphibians can breed in these pools, and their eggs and larvae won't all be gobbled up by fish. And certification is the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program's way of identifying and keeping track of pools that have been shown to function as habitat for these sensitive amphibians. Vernal pools come in many different forms. There are some that just have no emergent vegetation, just a simple big puddle in the woods. And others are full of dense shrubs, like this winterberry swamp. And some are small, just 20 feet or so across. And others are like this one between Mount Tom and Route 141 in East Hampton can be huge. This one's maybe 1/4 of a mile long, but it does dry up, at least in some years. And not all vernal pools are in the woods. This one you can see in the background, it's right up, there's a lawn right up to the edge of it, and this is kind of what we're trying to avoid with vernal pool certification, is protect them from this kind of degradation. There's the vernal pool itself is where the amphibians come to breed, but they all have upland habitat where they live the whole rest of the year. And so if the surroundings is all lawns or parking lots, then the vernal pool isn't going to be of much value as a habitat for amphibians. Okay, so there are two methods you can use to document vernal pools for certification, and the one that I've used 100% of the time is the obligate species method. I'll talk about the facultative species method later, but the obligate species method is really the simplest one. You just have to show two things. First, evidence of a pool with no permanently flowing outlet. So all you need for that is a photo of the pool holding water, or if it's a large one, you might need to take several photos of its whole perimeter. But just a picture of the pool holding water, and the other piece of evidence you need is presence either of fairy shrimp, which is the one obligate vernal pool invertebrate that's recognized by the state, or breeding evidence of obligate amphibian species, which are wood frogs or the various species of mole salamanders. So fairy shrimp are these little crustaceans in vernal pools. This is my foot in a vernal pool. You can see they're very tiny, floating above my foot there. But they have these little googly eyes on either side of their head. And this one is a male here, but the females have these dense clusters of eggs. What you need, I believe you need a picture of an adult female with eggs to certify a vernal pool, but you only need a picture of one female fairy shrimp, so it's pretty easy if you find a fairy shrimp. And the reason fairy shrimp are obligate vernal pool species is that their eggs need to dry out before they'll hatch. And that when they get older, they're about 1 inch long and they get kind of greenish tinged. So here's another one on her side with some eggs right there. Another female with eggs. You get the idea. And there are actually two species of fairy shrimp. There's one common one, and then there's a state-listed rare species that the males have different antennae. You can look that up online if you want to learn how to distinguish those, but either one will work for certification purposes. Okay, so that was the one vernal pool obligate invertebrate, and then there's, for the amphibians, there's one frog that counts as a vernal pool obligate, the wood frog. Below here, there's a male and a female. At least in breeding season, they're fairly different looking. The males are more of a dark brown color, and the females are more reddish. But there are several different pieces of evidence you can use to document that wood frogs are using a vernal pool for breeding. You can either record a full chorus, so that's many frogs calling at once with overlapping calls, not just a single one calling. And at the end of this slideshow, I'll give you a link to a website where you can listen to the different types of frogs and learn their calls. Some people say wood frogs sound like ducks, but I don't know. They don't sound like ducks to me. They sound like wood frogs. But, so you can either record a full chorus or take a picture or pictures showing 5 or more mated pairs, or pictures showing 5 or more egg masses, or 1 or more tadpoles or transforming juveniles. So this pond is covered with male wood frogs that are floating around and calling. So this picture by itself wouldn't be sufficient for certification, but if you had a tape recorder going, or any recording device, that would certainly do the trick there. But when wood frogs are calling, they're rather than this big balloon coming out the front of their throat, as many frogs have when they're calling, they have bubbles come out on either side of them because they're floating on the water. So this is a male gurgling away. Here is a mated pair with a spotted salamander in the background, incidentally. Another mated pair here. And wood frogs, by the way, you can recognize by this mask on the side of their head. And they're called wood frogs because they live in the woods, in the dry woods, the whole rest of the year, and they steer clear of water except when they're breeding. But so here are 2 mated pairs on a big pile of egg masses. And often all of the egg masses in a pond will be all together at the north end of the pond, and that's because the ice first starts to melt at the north end where the sun is reflecting off. I mean, the sun will be in the south, but it's reflecting off the north end back into the water. And also you have the shade from the trees at the south end, so 2 different reasons that the ice ends up thawing there first. But there's probably only 1 female in this picture, and there's just a whole ball of males around them, so you'd need several more pictures like that if you're trying to certify using the pictures of mated. But in this picture there are, let's see, I think we have 5 here. There's 1 pair here and another one here, a 3rd one, a 4th one, a 5th one, and there's actually 5.5 mated pairs here. So this picture alone is enough to certify the vernal pool. And when the egg masses first come out, all the eggs are very close together, as in these 2, and then they start to spread out as they fill with water. And a closer example of a fresh egg mass coming right out of the female there, and then an egg mass that's a little bit older. And wood frog egg masses are recognizable by not having any jelly matrix surrounding them, which the salamander eggs you'll see later have. It's just each individual egg is stuck together in this big mass. So this whole mass is from 1 female. hundreds of eggs. Again, one female's egg mass here. This is definitely more than 5 egg masses. It gets kind of hard to count when they're all stuck together, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's probably at least 10 different females' egg masses here. And you can see my hand holding them up for scale there. Also, that I was doing that because the glare makes it hard to take pictures of eggs underwater. So it's useful to either use your shadow to cut the glare, or sometimes you can gently lift them out of the water without detaching them from whatever is holding them underwater. So here's an example of a whole bunch of egg masses, probably 50 different egg masses in this picture, all at the north end of a pond. And as they get further along, this algae starts to grow on them and they become harder to discern the boundaries between different egg masses. And again, here there are maybe 20 or 30 different egg masses, but they're all just kind of blending together. And all that scum there is all the algae on lots and lots of wood frog egg masses. And this is an even later stage. And then when the tadpoles start to hatch, like these little guys here, for the first several days after they hatch, they're just feeding on the algae that grows on their egg masses. Here are a bunch doing that here. So when wood frog tadpoles first come out, they have these little external gills you can see, but they very quickly go away. And that's the main way you distinguish frog tadpoles from salamander tadpoles, is the frog tadpoles don't have external gills. And as they get older, they get more pronounced heads. And to distinguish wood frogs definitively from other frog tadpoles, you want to look at their bellies. And there's this gold, shiny, circular area on the underside that the other frogs around here don't have. So taking pictures of egg masses is the easiest way to prove you've got wood frog eggs. But if you're stuck with just tadpoles later in the season, then you want to get pictures of their bellies. And here is a wood frog tadpole next to a Jefferson Salamander, and it's got some external gills there, and its forelegs are starting to grow, but we'll get to some better pictures of those shortly. All right, so wood frogs were the one obligate vernal pool frog, and then the other obligate vernal pool amphibians are the mole salamanders. And they're called mole salamanders because when they're not breeding in ponds, they're off in the woods living in tunnels of moles and other small mammals underground. There is one common species of mole salamander in Massachusetts, the spotted salamander, and the other 3 species are all on the state list of rare and endangered. Well, none of them are listed as endangered, but they're listed rare species. So endangered is the highest level of protection, the most rare species. And then threatened is the next level, and marbled salamanders are threatened, and the blue-spotted salamander, I have special concern / threatened there, because blue-spotted salamanders and Jefferson salamanders are part of this confusing hybrid complex that actually has genes of 5 different salamanders mixed in, and it's a big confusing mess. But you don't need to worry about that too much, because the pure blue-spotted salamanders, which are the threatened population, are only in the eastern part of Massachusetts. And for our purposes, we can call anything in western Massachusetts Jefferson salamanders, even if they're hybrids of Jeffersons and blue spots, which many of them are, and they're these female-only populations that I won't get into too much detail about all the strange biology going on there, but they basically look like Jefferson salamanders. So the evidence for salamanders is similar to the evidence you want to capture for wood frogs, except they don't call, so there's no audio recordings involved. But you can either get a picture of congressing adults, a whole bunch hanging out together underwater, males courting females, or you can get a picture of spermatophores, or a marbled salamander attending a nest, or 5 spotted salamander egg masses, or just one egg mass of a state-listed rare species, so any of the species other than spotted salamanders, or one or more larvae or transforming juveniles. So the spotted salamander is very distinctive, kind of purplish-brown salamander with yellow spots, and they're 6 inches long or so. And both the wood frogs and the spotted salamanders will come out to breed on the first rainy night in spring that's a little bit above 40 degrees. So here is a picture of congressing adult spotted salamanders underwater. There's maybe 10 of them all scattered around here. And this is, I was out at night with flashlight getting these pictures. And the way salamander mating works is the males deposit these spermatophores, these little white jelly-like packets of sperm, and they do a little dance to try to entice females to come pick up these spermatophores. But for certification, if you just get a picture of these spermatophores, that'll do it. And it doesn't, all of the mole salamander spermatophores look similar, but since they're all considered obligate vernal pool species, it doesn't matter which species this is. And sometimes they're all lined up along a twig like this. Okay, spotted salamander egg masses. I mentioned earlier that the wood frog eggs do not have a matrix of jelly or jello around them, but here you can see the spotted salamanders have that. Similar size to the wood frog egg masses. Again, this is all a single female's eggs here, and here's another female's eggs there. And as with the wood frogs, there can be 100 or more eggs in the mass. Several different examples. They often have a kind of bluish cast to them. And so here are 5 different egg masses. This one picture, or maybe 6, this one picture by itself is enough to certify the vernal pool. And sometimes, for whatever reason, certain individual spotted salamanders lay these cloudy white egg masses. I'm not sure if anyone really knows why that is, but there are several of these clear ones here and this one cloudy white one. Another one of the cloudy ones, they just kind of look out of focus, even if they're not. And I usually don't see a whole bunch of the white ones together, but here's a big pile of them. And a bigger pile of them, and there are just as many of the non-cloudy ones here, they're just harder to see. So here are some of the clear ones here and here and here. But there's a good, probably 50 or more egg masses here. And you don't see the spotted salamander egg masses all clustered at the north end as you do with the wood frog eggs, but sometimes, especially in ponds where there aren't a lot of submerged branches to attach the eggs to, there will be a big pile right in the center in the deepest part of the pond, which makes it hard to get at them to take a picture, which is why I ended up with this one with the glare on the surface. Not an ideal picture. Here's a better picture. The sun was cooperating with me there. Good 15 or 20 egg masses there. Here's an example of using my shadow to cut the glare. So here is one wood frog tadpole on a big spotted salamander egg mass with the embryos starting to develop. And a neat thing about spotted salamanders is there's a symbiotic alga, this green here, that lives inside the embryo, and it actually becomes incorporated into the larva's body, and so the larva is actually able to photosynthesize and make its own food because of the algae that's in it while it's developing. And these masses show that those green embryos really well, or the cell around. What do you call that? Anyway, the whole the area surrounding the larva. Right. So a closer example of that. And here is a wood frog tadpole and a spotted salamander larva together. You can clearly see those external gills on the salamander and no external gills on the wood frog. And it's typical for the spotted salamander larvae to be smaller than the wood frog tadpoles. The wood frogs just, even if they lay eggs at the same time, the wood frogs are developing more quickly. Here's another spotted salamander larva with its front legs just starting to develop. The front legs develop sooner than the back legs do. Couple more spotted salamander larvae. And this is a metamorph, so a young one, it's just emerged from a pond, I think. Or at least it's in its first year, and it has just the faintest yellow speckling on its body. Okay, the blue-spotted salamander I'm not going to talk about much because they're only in eastern Mass, but you can see why they're called blue-spotted salamanders. And this is one from the one pure blue spot population, I think in the town of Easton, Mass. But there are lots of in-betweeny blue spot Jefferson salamanders scattered around the state. So here is a Jefferson salamander. These are in the Berkshires and in the Connecticut Valley, and I believe, yeah, there are definitely some in the hill towns. And there's some faint blue speckling on them, but they're basically these pale brownish, slightly purplish salamanders, more slender than the spotted salamanders. And they come out a bit earlier in the spring than the spotted salamanders. They have a lower threshold of what temperature gets them going to the ponds. So here's a pond that's completely covered with ice, but in this little narrow melted edge there that was all full of Jefferson salamander eggs. And this is one that I went out one spring in Sunderland on March 2nd when there was still a foot of snow to a vernal pool where I knew there were Jefferson salamanders. And even though there was solid ice on the top of the pond, there was maybe a half an inch of water on top of it, and this one-eyed Jefferson salamander was swimming around on the ice trying to find a way in. And you can see this one has quite a bit more blue than that one I showed you crossing the road earlier. So this is that pond that had just a little bit of melted ice along the edge, and Jefferson salamander eggs all over these branches here. So Jefferson salamander egg masses are much smaller than spotted salamander egg masses with fewer eggs, and rather than being attached to the twig on one side, they tend to surround the twig and be very elongate. And the eggs tend to be spaced further apart. They're just generally looser egg masses, so if you pick it up, it's kind of floppy, and the embryos will all spread out in your hand, whereas the spotted salamander egg masses are more firm, like jello. So here is on the left a spotted salamander egg mass with really dense eggs and 100 or more eggs in it, and then this is a Jefferson egg mass with much more spaced out eggs, not as bluish, and it's surrounding this blade of grass, rather than the spotted one is kind of attached on the side of a clump of grass. And these are the same two egg masses, but just with my hand behind them, so you can see better how clear the Jefferson egg mass is without the bluish cast that the spotted ones have. Another example of a Jefferson egg mass next to a spotted egg mass. In this case, the Jefferson egg mass is bigger, but it's still the density of the eggs and the elongate shape helps you distinguish the two. Also, there looks like two different egg masses here. Jefferson egg mass is getting a little older. Another one that's not so elongate, but still clearly very spread out eggs, and the jelly goes all around here. It's kind of hard to see. This is an example showing how floppy they are when you pick them up. And so one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that unlike the wood frog eggs, the salamander eggs have a double membrane around the egg. So there's this membrane, and then there's another one just inside that. And on the Jefferson salamander eggs, those two membranes are very close together. But on the spotted salamander eggs, they're much further apart. So here's the place where you can see that clearly, this outer membrane and then this inner membrane here. And another way you can often easily recognize the eggs of the Jefferson blue spot complex is that the eggs often don't get fertilized, so after a while they just start to die and turn white without ever developing. So all of these white ones are non-viable eggs, and they start to burst eventually, and then you really know they're not viable. So here's some older masses that are getting green and it's full of algae, but you can see the white embryos inside. But here are a few larvae that are developing inside that mass. So a Jefferson mass with the larvae developing more. All of them were viable in this mass here. They look like little Pac-Mans at first. Then here's one where the larvae are already starting to hatch out. And they can get greenish. They must have a similar symbiotic algae to what the spotted salamanders have. But these larvae, you can see the gills forming, definitely ready to pop out. And here is a larva that has hatched. It looks a lot like the spotted salamander. There are keys you can find online to distinguish the different mole salamander larvae. But again, for certification purposes, it doesn't really matter which one you have. These were being raised in an aquarium, so this one's actually against the side of the aquarium. It's not unhealthy or anything. It's just pressed against the glass there. And so here's a Jefferson that's starting to grow its front leg and just a little hint of a hind leg there. So as I mentioned, the spotted salamander larvae are going to be smaller than the wood frog larvae, but the Jefferson larvae if the eggs are laid earlier and they develop faster, they're going to be much bigger than the spotted larvae and bigger than the wood frog tadpoles, or maybe about the same size as the wood frogs. So this is a spotted larva above and a Jefferson larva below. A wood frog tadpole next to a slightly larger Jefferson larva. Again, external gills means salamander, no external gills means frog. Bunch of shiny golden wood frog bellies, and the mostly plain white throat tells you it's not a marbled salamander. We'll get to actual marbled salamanders in a minute, but that's why I was taking pictures of throats of these things. And the way I was doing that was I just had a clear plastic case, like I think a package that batteries came in, but anything like that will work. And then I just filled it partially with water and caught the tadpoles and larvae with a net and dropped them in there and then held it over my head to get the belly shots. So this is a Jefferson that has a little bit of speckling around the edge of its chin, but this area is really the area you want to look at to decide if you're looking at a marbled larva. Later in the season, the Jefferson larvae will be up to 4 centimeters or so long before they exit the ponds. All right, marbled salamanders come out even earlier than the Jeffersons to breed. In fact, they come before winter. The females come to ponds that are dry, but there are certain vernal pools that fill up in the fall rather than being dry all winter. And those are the ones that marbled salamanders need, because they lay their eggs and then stay with them until the pool fills with water. And their larvae are slowly developing all winter, and in the spring they're ready to start eating the eggs and larvae of the tadpoles and spotted salamanders and various other bugs that are in the ponds. And again, this is a threatened species. There are marbled salamanders in the Connecticut Valley and a few in the Berkshires. No one has found them in the hill towns yet, but they could turn up. They tend to be in more oaky forests. But here is one that I found in Stockbridge. Before that, there weren't known to be any in the Berkshires. But take a look at this wood frog tadpole here. In this next picture, it has disappeared, but without moving, that marbled salamander larva just slurped the wood frog tadpole into its mouth, and so it's just sucked it in, and that's how they feed. That's pretty neat. But this one was, trying to think if this was April or, it was probably early May, but this larva already is starting to get its hind legs, and it's much bigger than the tadpole. So if you see a big salamander larva like that, you can be pretty sure it's one of the rare ones, although occasionally spotted salamander larvae will overwinter if the eggs are laid really late. And so that's why it's important to look at the throats to decide if you really have a marbled salamander, if you see a huge salamander larva in the spring. So here's a top view of a marbled salamander. In the bottom view, you can see it's got the speckling all over its throat. So this whole area here. And here's one with very well developed hind legs. All right, so those are all the species that are involved in the obligate species method of vernal pool certification. With the facultative species method, you again need a picture showing that the pool has no permanently flowing outlet. So pictures of the pool holding water, but then you also need pictures of the entire pool dry to prove that fish can't possibly be living there. And then you need breeding evidence for 2 or more facultative vernal pool amphibian species. And the breeding evidence for these facultative species is the same as for wood frogs. You either record a full chorus or get pictures of 5 or more mated pairs or 1 or more egg masses. So it doesn't have to be 5 egg masses as with the wood frogs, but 1 or more tadpoles are transforming juveniles. And this is for each of the 2 or more species that you find there. So I'll just briefly go through these facultative species. The spring peepers are these little ones with X's on their backs, and they go peep, 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 and there's a whole, when there's a whole chorus of them, it's a really shrill, almost deafening sound if you're close to them. Here's a mated pair of peepers. And the tadpoles also have these little X's on their backs, but I've never seen a peeper egg, but they lay their eggs singly and hidden under vegetation, so it's not very practical to go looking for peeper eggs to certify a vernal pool. Gray tree frogs call from the trees, but then when they're really breeding, they'll be down more at eye or ear level in ponds, perched on shrubs. And they have, their call is kind of like a brrr, brrr, kind of sounds like a telephone. American toads have a really long-lasting trill for their call. Here's a mating pair, male's head and the female's head there under my... The toad eggs that come in these long strands, and this is... these are getting covered with sediment in the bottom of the pool, but they're just a whole chain of eggs in a spiral. And toads will breed in very temporary pools. This is a whole bunch of little tadpoles in a puddle, which, as you can see, is a tire rut. So this is why you need 2 or more species to document to certify using the facultative species method, because these facultative species are not nearly as picky as the wood frogs and the mole salamanders about where they'll lay eggs. And this is a little toadlet that has recently emerged from a pool. Since it doesn't have its tail anymore, this wouldn't be evidence for certification, but if it was still in the water or had just come out with a little bit of a tail remnant, then that might count. So finding vernal pools, the state has a great tool, a map of all these potential vernal pools that were found, identified using aerial photo interpretation. And this you can find on the state's website, but they... some of these potential vernal pools will turn out to be other dark objects, like a clump of hemlock trees or the shadow of a water tower or something like that. And not all of the vernal pools are on the potential vernal pool layer. When I did a thorough survey of vernal pools in the town of Pelham a number of years ago, there were something like... I think there were 37 potential vernal pools in the town, and I ended up finding that 25 of them were certifiable, and then I found another 25 certifiable vernal pools that weren't on the potential vernal pool map. So it definitely is worth looking and listening while you're out and about in the spring. You might just notice a water body that's worth investigating, or as you're walking through the woods, you'll hear the gurgling of wood frogs. The sound carries pretty far, and you can just follow that sound and find new vernal pools that way. And then keeping an eye out the rest of the year, sometimes you can find vernal pools when they're dry. There'll be a staining to the leaves that will look darker than the leaves in the surrounding forest, and you can find evidence of some aquatic invertebrates just lying there in a depression on the forest floor, including shells of fingernail clams, they're about the size of your fingernail, that's why they're called that. and caddisfly cases, these caterpillar-like larvae that live underwater and build portable houses out of bits of vegetation. What to bring? Okay, so first of all, you want to have landowner permission before you go out to a vernal pool to certify it. If you have a fancy smartphone, then it will cover a lot of the things on this list. But if you don't, you'll want to bring a camera. It can be handy to have a video recorder if you have a large vernal pool and you want to show the whole perimeter of it. Rather than taking a whole series of still photos, you can walk the perimeter and maybe capture a number of egg masses and breeding pairs and that sort of thing while you're doing it, or just an audio recorder to record chorusing frogs, a GPS unit to record your location, a notebook and writing implements to take notes, numbers of egg masses, directions to the pool, that sort of thing. Polarized sunglasses are extremely helpful to see through the glare to find egg masses. Knee boots or even waders to get into those deeper vernal pools. Often you can take all the pictures you need just from the edge of the pond, but sometimes all the salamander eggs are in a big pile in the middle and it's 4 feet deep and you have to get in a little further to get pictures. A container, it's handy to have a white container for taking pictures of fairy shrimp or larvae, but if you want to get pictures of the bellies of wood frogs or the throats of marbled salamanders, having a clear container, as I showed earlier, is useful for that. If you're going out earlier in the season and there are just egg masses, a net might not be that important, although for catching fairy shrimp, they're useful. Later in the season, to get pictures of tadpoles or salamander larvae, it's definitely useful to have a net. And then a field guide if you're not comfortable identifying all these things. What does Vernal Pool Certification accomplish and what doesn't it accomplish? So the reason there is Vernal Pool Certification is because vernal pools are not protected under the Massachusetts Wetland Protection Act unless they are certified by Natural Heritage. And there are also the Federal Clean Water Act and certain other state regulations will also protect certain certified vernal pools. However, the certified vernal pools are only protected under the Massachusetts Wetland Protection Act if they're already in jurisdictional wetlands. And due to some clerical error, apparently, when the Wetlands Protection Act was being enacted, wetlands only became jurisdictional if they were adjacent to streams. So isolated swamps out in the woods are not necessarily protected. If they hold a certain amount of water, like a 1/4 acre foot, so that's 1/4 in surface area and a foot deep, or an equivalent volume. If it holds that much water at any time of year, a vernal pool can be protected, or is protected under the Wetlands Protection Act, regardless of whether it's certified or not. But otherwise, there are lots of certifiable vernal pools out there that actually would not be covered under the Wetlands Protection Act. And there's a 100-foot radius around the vernal pool that's protected, but only to the extent that that radius is within an existing, otherwise jurisdictional wetland. But what certification does accomplish is adding the wildlife habitat as something that has to be considered if a project is being proposed that would impact a wetland where there's a vernal pool. It has to be demonstrated that that vernal pool won't be adversely impacted. So local bylaws can be enacted that strengthen protections for vernal pools, and they can even protect vernal pools whether or not they're certified. But some local bylaws give the same protections to all certified vernal pools, and often add a 100-foot buffer and treat that all as a protected wetland. Rare species habitat, so whether or not a vernal pool is considered a protected wetland, if you find Jefferson salamanders or marbled salamanders or blue-spotted salamanders, then the vernal pools, all certified vernal pools end up getting considered when Natural Heritage is drawing their estimated habitat for these rare species. And so they'll have protocols for drawing the estimated habitat that will kind of engulf all the vernal pools within a certain radius of where a rare salamander was found. So they're used in that way. And then in land protection, land trusts hopefully are looking at things like where rare species have been found and where vernal pools have been found to help prioritize areas for protection. So even if with local bylaws protecting every certified vernal pool and a 100-foot radius around it, as I mentioned in the beginning, that these amphibians all go much further than 100 feet from the vernal pool the whole rest of the year for the upland habitat. So they really need much more than that protected around them. So it's good where possible to plan land protection around where there are good clusters of quality vernal pools. So they're really protected in both the breeding habitat and the upland habitat. And landowner education, if you're going to certify a vernal pool on private land, bringing out the landowner to show them this great resource they have on their land is a great opportunity for educating the public. All right, and that is it for my presentation. I'm just ending with this slide telling you to, if you don't know the wood frog, the sound of wood frogs or peepers or toads or gray tree frogs, you can go to this great website made by Lang Elliott, musicofnature.com, Calls of Frogs and Toads of the Northeast. So that's it. Thanks very much for listening.